recently heard someone say, if these walls could talk. And the implication is that if the walls could talk, they could tell secrets, if only they could. But sometimes walls do talk. Think about billboards, for instance, or message boards. Even ordinary walls have photographs and mementos that can communicate a story. When I was growing up, our apartment wall was covered with reminders of my family's past. Above our kitchen table, there hung a colorful map of Bermuda because my mother was from Bermuda and it was the place that she left behind to marry my dad. And in the living room, there was a painting of an African village representing Zaire, where my father grew up. And then there was also this faded poster. This is a photograph from the Tower of London. It shows a name, Thomas, and the Abel family emblem etched into the stone wall. Right there. I was told that Thomas Abel was an ancestor, an English priest who had carved his name in our family emblem while he was imprisoned there. As an adult, I became more curious, and so I started digging into his story. And what I found inspired me so much, I decided to write a book about it. So, who was Thomas Abel? If you've been around for a while, you probably remember other speeches I've given, and I've told you that Thomas Abel was a 16th century English priest. He was an Oxford tutor, a musician, and a man fluent in several European languages. But this is not why he's famous. We only know about Thomas Abel because he was he was caught in the middle of the messiest divorce in English history. Some might even call it the most consequential breakup in European history, as it led really to the English Reformation. I'm speaking, of course, of King Henry VIII's battle to divorce his first wife, Queen Catherine of Aragon. So, a little background here. Henry and Catherine had been married for 20 years. They had several children, but only one survived infancy. Her name was Princess Mary. She was a girl. And King Henry feared that the Tudor dynasty would not survive without a son. And it seemed that poor Queen Catherine was too old to bear another child. And rather conveniently, King Henry already had someone in mind to replace Catherine, his mistress, Anne Boleyn. Perhaps he wished to frolic with her a bit more. He hoped that Anne Boleyn could give him a prince that he wanted and really desperately needed. But there was a problem. In the 16th century Europe, you couldn't just get divorced. The Pope had personally granted permission for Henry and Catherine's marriage. So to undo it, Henry needed annulment, declaring that the marriage was invalid from the very beginning. So to make this happen, his chief advisor, you could call him his fixer, Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, removed Catherine's Spanish household and he replaced them with English attendants, ones that he believed would be loyal to the king. And one of these men was Thomas Abel. So Wolsey instructed Thomas to serve the queen as her personal confessor, but he expected him to report back to him, essentially requiring Thomas Abel to act as a spy for the king. And in 1529, Henry sent Thomas on a special mission to Spain to retrieve a document from the Spanish archives. But Thomas suspected that the king's motives were not purely to collect evidence. Thomas knew that this document could destroy the king's case, and so he began to suspect that perhaps the king wanted him to bring it back to England to make it disappear. So Thomas agonized about what to do next. If he disobeyed the king, he might very well pay for it with his life. But could he live with himself if he went along with the deception? Now, I won't tell you what Thomas did next, but I will tell you that he began opposing the king, first secretly and then very publicly. As you can imagine, he was eventually arrested and imprisoned in the Tower of London, where he spent the next 7 years. On July 30th, 1540, Thomas Abel was executed for treason. Now, he has been largely forgotten by most people, but the walls of Thomas Abel's cell still speak loudly. Every day, hundreds, if not thousands, of tourists walk past the carving Thomas Abel made, even though few of them know the story about the man who made it. And so I decided I wanted to do something about that. Now, if any of this history of King Henry VIII and his famous divorce sounds familiar to you, it's probably because the Tudor period is one of the most written about eras in English history. Think kings and queens and palace intrigue. You may have seen it in movies or miniseries, or maybe you've read a book about it, like Wolf Hall, which was an international bestseller. But not many people have heard about Thomas Abel. Despite his mark on the wall, his voice in history has been largely silent. So I decided to tell Thomas's story from his point of view. Now I wanted to root the story in as much known historical fact as possible, but I also wanted to explore Thomas's motivations and include that in the narrative. So 3 years ago, I began researching this story. I actually traveled to London and read 500-year-old records, and I visited the Tower of London. And I eventually decided to write Thomas's story as historical fiction so I could use my interpretation of his internal thoughts and motivations. So I wrote The Queen's Priest, the story of Thomas Abel, and it was just released on Thomas's feast day about 2 weeks ago on July 30th. Now, if you enjoy historical fiction and you would like to read The Queen's Priest, you can actually download the ebook on Amazon. I can put that link in the chat. And if you prefer paperback, that will be released in a few days on Amazon. I also have a QR code. If you would like to scan that, you can actually join my newsletter and hear more about Thomas Abel, my research, and the ongoing historical fiction projects that I'm working on. They say walls can tell stories, and in this case, they actually do. And so I want to thank you for allowing me to share my story and Thomas Abel's story with you. Thank you, Madam Toastmaster.